Hello everyone and good evening, and thank you so much for joining me tonight. I am here with Sarah Raughley and Elle. So, a little information. Sarah Raughley grew up in southern Ontario writing stories about freakish little girls with powers because she secretly wanted to be one. She is a huge fangirl of anything from manga to sci-fi fantasy, TV to Japanese role-playing games and other geeky things, all of which have largely inspired her writing. Sarah has been nominated for the Aurora Award for Best YA Novel and works in the community doing writer workshops for youths and adults. On top of being a YA writer, Sarah has a PhD in English, which makes her a doctor, so it turns out she didn't have to go to medical school after all. As an academic, Sarah has taught undergraduate courses and acted as a postdoctoral fellow. Her research concerns representations of race and gender in popular media culture, youth culture, and post-colonialism. She has written and edited articles in political, cultural, and academic publications. She continues to use her voice for good. You can find her online at sarahraughley.com. The Bones of Ruin is her debut novel. I'm also joined with Elle. Elle is the author of the instant New York Times and indie bestseller Wings of Ebony, a young adult novel about a black teen who must lean into her ancestors' magic to protect her inner city community from drugs, violence, and crime. Miss Magazine calls it the debut fantasy we need right now. She also wrote its sequel, Ashes of Gold, which is releasing in January 2022. Elle is a former educator and first-generation college student with a bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's in educational administration and human development. When she's not writing, Elle can be found mentoring aspiring writers, binging reality TV, loving on her three littles, or cooking up something true to her Louisiana roots. So without further ado, I'm going to be quiet and let the two stars of the show talk. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks, Drew.
Hey, happy release day. Now,
thank you.
One thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is not your debut, right? No. You have several books out, and I want to actually talk about some of that. So why don't we just jump right into it? To start, for those who haven't read, this is my very well-loved copy. It's all kinds of, I've carried it around for so long. It's just been well-loved. But what for people in the audience who may not have read or may not be familiar with what the book is about, can you tell us a little bit about Bones of Ruin? What is it about?
Well, I'm so happy that I just got a whole box of the hardcovers, and it's so shiny. I just love having hardcovers in my hand. So hi everybody, I'm Sarah Raughley, and you know what, the Bones of Ruin was inspired largely by some of the research that I did as a post-colonialist. I've learned a lot about the way that England was in the 19th century because it was, very romantic on one level, how it's usually depicted in books and films and things like that, like Sherlock Holmes. But actually, this is also a time of colonialism and imperialism. And the story of Sarah Bartman, who was a young African woman from South Africa who was sort of kidnapped, well, not kidnapped, but she was taken to England, and she was put on display in a human zoo. And this story really struck me when I learned about it. And I really wanted to talk a little bit more about what it would be like for a Black person having come from Africa and being in this sort of entertainment profession. This time, the main character Iris is in a circus in the 19th century in London. So this is really, I like to say that this is 19th century Hunger Games, supernatural Hunger Games, because Iris, the main character, sees an African tightrope dancer in 19th century London, and she has a supernatural ability. She can't die. And so she's sort of roped into this tournament of freaks in which she has to fight against other supernatural folks. But there's that underlying layer of talking about colonialism and racism and how things might have been like for somebody who was African living in 19th century London.
Yeah, no, I think that's what struck me. I wasn't sure what to expect when I started reading, and I don't read a lot of historical fantasy. I do in general like historical fiction, but I don't read a lot of historical fantasy fiction. And that was one of the things that really struck me about this book, is that it isn't just a fantasy novel that sort of like takes you away to this romanticized time. It is chock full of really, and I have more questions about this later. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but really just challenging and deep themes that I would love to know more about, where your interest and inspiration came from, and just like how incredibly taxing too, you know, because there's an emotionally taxing element when you dig into these things. And I do think that fantasy gives us that veneer to make it sort of one step removed from reality. But it's just, there's so many sharp parallels in this book, and just really pointed themes that the way you sort of grafted sort of real world things and, you know, fantasy fiction was just really, really intriguing to me. So, okay, so before you wrote this, you wrote YA sci-fi. I'm curious, just to back up a little bit, what inspired the shift to historical fiction or historical fantasy?
Yeah, my first series called the Ebony series. I hope there are some people watching that have read it and are fans.
Oh, right back there.
Oh, I think I see it. So, yeah, you know, I'm a big geek. So, Fate of Flames was very much inspired by Sailor Moon. And I like to pitch the Ebony series as Sailor Moon meets Pacific Rim. So it's like, you know, for those who know Sailor Moon, you know, there's like a girl gang, Sailor Scouts, and they fight evil. It's not that it's difficult. But I really thought it would be cool to think about, you know, girls of today. You know, what if there were girls of today who had to fight monsters, fight evil, but they didn't have masks. They didn't have secret identities. So they had to deal with contemporary issues like contemporary stardom and fandom, and just the way in which, you know, our contemporary society tends to devalue girls, right? And I guess what made me shift back to the 19th century is there was a chunk of, you know, historical fiction within the Effigy series. It comes more into play in the last book, but the more I started to research for that part, the more I wanted to really like set a story in the 19th century. I wanted to go deeper into this time because, you know, 19th century Europe was very influential in constructing the world that we live in today. You know, this was the time of the Industrial Revolution, but it was also the time of scientific racism. It was the time of, you know, different revolutions and different nation building. And it's just a really interesting time to look at, especially through the lens of a Black girl, right? Because at this time, at the end of the 1800s, you have the scramble for Africa. And I don't know if anybody knows about this, but this was kind of when all of the European powers kind of went to Africa and decided to basically carve it up and say, okay, this region belongs to France, this region belongs to Britain, and all of these really earth-shattering, you know, geopolitical things were happening in this era. So I thought, why not, you know, set a book in this era and really go deep into these, you know, political issues.
And you absolutely do. You absolutely do. And I think part of the thing, just as a fellow fantasy author, that pulled me in so deeply is how incredibly immersive the world building is, particularly the magic system. I was just really enthralled by these characters that have these gifts, and you bait the reader so well in the beginning of the story, in terms of like, you know, understanding what their gifts are. Are there more of them? How much do we know about them? And so I was really pulled through the pages trying to get to the truth of like, you know, what's behind sort of these magical gifts or abilities that these characters have. I'd love to know more about the specific research you did to develop the world and the magic. I'm so intrigued by that.
Yeah, the magic, you know, it's something that I've been a geek for so long. So certain, you know, supernatural magic systems and things like that, and people with powers, that's just something that I grew up with. I've heard people describe the book as like X-Men meets the Hunger Games. It's very much, people with certain different kinds of powers, and oftentimes the powers would come through thinking about who the characters are, and what are sort of the seminal aspects of their lives. And there is an in-story reason for why they have the powers that they have. And it's kind of like, it's a spoiler, so I don't want to discuss it too much, but definitely when thinking about the main characters with their particular stories, I thought about who the characters were, why they might have a certain, or what is, a seminal thing that happened in their lives, and how might that translate into a magical power. Like, for example, there's an Inuit character from Labrador in this book, based off of, I watched a National Geographic documentary about an actual Inuk person in the 1800s who was taken to Europe, thinking that it would be, a great time, he'll be able to learn about the world outside of Labrador. But he was, like Sarah Bartman, he was displayed in a human zoo, and he was taken all across Europe, and eventually died of smallpox, because he wasn't vaccinated when he got there. So another tragic story. And the story talked about, the documentary talked about, just how difficult it was for him to go to another land, to be taken to another land and to not understand the language, to be overwhelmed by the sounds of industrial Europe from sort of the small village that he came from. So when I base a character, my character Jacob, off of that story and this person's experience, I really started to think about, what is it like to be brought to another land and to be overwhelmed by just the absolute culture shock and the inability to speak the language, the inability to assimilate. And that's where I got Jacob's power from, that he can sort of change people's languages. He can sort of force other people to not be able to understand each other. He could create his own languages and things like that. So, it was very much going deep into who these characters were and trying to come up with a power that suited that. And, the typical research that I did for the book really went into discovering who these characters are, because they are very diverse. So it's about sort of understanding, what would the life of somebody who's the son of a young Turk, from the Ottoman Empire, what would that character's life look like in 19th century London, and what are the issues that he might come up against, various things like that. And obviously just the typical geek stuff of knowing a bunch of powers offhand.
No, I think that really comes through. I was really moved. I mean, I would say by like the second or third, like the third chapter, once you see, again, I don't want to do a ton of spoilers, and disclaimer, I haven't finished the ending yet. So I'm glad you didn't say anything about that earlier, because I don't want it spoiled. But in the beginning, watching the main character, her name is escaping me.
Iris,
yes. Watching Iris walk, it's even on the cover, on the tightrope. I remember reading and I paused. I've read the opening a few times now. I paused and I went back to the title, Bones of Ruin. And I just thought there was so much intention in just the selection of the words in that title, and the fact that, I guess it's not too much of a spoiler, she can't die, that's her ability. And so you have this really, I wouldn't say graphic, but you have this very sort of, on the face, sort of tragic opening where she's sort of trying to conceal her ability, because she's in a circus. She's not around people where it's okay to be herself. And so I was just very like, I felt like I was very aware of her bones just in general because of the fall, you know? And so then when I remember just kind of closing the book and like sitting with the title, and there was just so many layers, I think, that came through, especially like I can see the way you wove with intention, you know, the way that people's magic manifested as a way to sort of like give them this sort of figurative power in this circumstance where in the real world they wouldn't have that power. I just thought that was, I was enthralled by that. As a fantasy writer, you know, I'm always like really into the world and the magic. So I really loved being able to kind of sift through that. And just kind of see like the notes of intention there and the symbolism. And so I enjoyed that. Did you run across any particularly surprising discoveries in your research?
Just how prevalent, you know, I talk a lot about human zoos or other things, you know, like the Dahomey Amazons who were called the Ahozi, who are these women warriors in Africa at the time. That was actually very surprising. I didn't know that. If anybody has ever seen Black Panther, and most people have probably seen Black Panther, but what are they called? The Dora Milaje, the women warrior group in Black Panther, they're actually based off of a real military force of women that existed in the 19th century in the Kingdom of Dahomey. And the Europeans called them the Dahomey Amazons because to them they represented, or they were similar to like the Amazons of Greek mythology. But I learned a lot about them, as well as, you know, human zoos and some of the more dehumanizing aspects of the 19th century. To learn about this force of women warriors was really interesting, and it really brought me back to the idea of diaspora, you know, in terms of, you know, there are a lot of Africans who were taken forcefully, obviously, from Africa to different places, North America, the Caribbean, etc. And in many ways, you know, when I think about the Dahomey Amazons, on one hand, they represent, you know, girl power and, you know, women warriors, but on the other hand, a lot of them were sort of conscripted against their will into this military service, you know, having to serve the king. And a lot of them as well, they aided in the slave trade. They actually helped some European slave traders to capture people from neighboring tribes, you know, to be taken to other places in the world. So it was just very, you know, it forced me to kind of see the complexities of these relationships, that even, you know, when the media is kind of, you know, giving you the sanitized version, I guess, in Black Panther and something that we can celebrate, the real history, the real historical version, I guess, is a lot more complicated. You know, they did fight colonial forces, like they fought against the French. They were incredibly strong. They were incredibly well respected in their communities. And at the same time, they also were integral in enslaving others, you know, whether aiding in European forces or taking young women from other tribes and forcing them to become either workers in the Dahomey kingdom or part of the military force. So it just really goes to show that things are never so simple when it comes to history. But this is also something that, you know, it reminded me that this is why history is important, right? I mean, I never learned about this in school. I never learned about really anything to do with Africa when I was growing up. Not in high school and not even in undergrad, unless I took specific courses. But largely, none of the courses that I took really had professors that were interested in African history. So it's so important, I think, to know all of these complex things that were happening on the continent and that are still happening on the continent. And, it's just the more that I learn, the more that it makes me want to write more books that kind of shows my research and tells other people, this is kind of how it was. Here are some things that you didn't know. And hopefully people will take something away from it. Hopefully positive. But hopefully people will learn. People can learn through history books, but they can also learn through our fantasy novels, depending on what we put in them. So
that's actually a great segue to my next question. But before I jump into that, I just want to remind anybody in the audience, if you have questions, please submit those, because I will, towards the end, circle to as many of those as we have time for. So don't forget to get your questions in. Okay, so the next question I was going to ask is kind of along those lines. I was just really curious when I was reading Bones of Ruin, when I was really looking at sort of the meta level of the story, and I was curious what message or themes you were specifically wanting to dig into, because like we touched on earlier, this book does deal with some really heavy time periods for Black people, and so this book is obviously being published in America here, and so I'm just really curious to hear, as the author and the creator of this world and this narrative, what you were excited to sort of illuminate and dig into, and what themes and sort of messages you were excited to pull readers into through this book.
Well, as an English teacher, it's something where I really want to encourage people to kind of come away with their own ideas and to analyze the book on their own and to kind of see what they can bring out of the text. For me, one thing that I really wanted to do, and I don't want to go too deep into the complexity of it, but when I was growing up, I did not think that Black women could be heroes of a fantasy novel. And I'm sure, you have a similar experience. I'm sure a lot of Black fantasy authors, have similar experience. I don't think I wrote my first Black heroine until I was 14 years old. And I've been writing since I was 3-4 years old. So it was just hard, growing up to see myself as a heroine. And oftentimes when you see young Black women in books or in TV series, movies, we're often kind of like the side characters. And there are all these conceptions, all these ideas, all these things that people take for granted or take as a granted, right? Like this idea that if you're a Black woman, you are not meant to be a viable love interest for anybody. For example, you are not to be loved. You are not lovable. Certainly more than one person would not be interested in you. You are not special. You are supposed to be kind of the sidekick to the one who is special, right? The main character, who is usually the white girl. And just various things like that. And I really wanted to have a Black girl front and center who was experiencing, maybe this is my revenge as a Vampire Diaries watcher and watching how they did my girl Bonnie. Oh Lord, how they did my girl Bonnie. Was not into that, but I really wanted, the main character to be a young Black woman who is special, who is the chosen one, who does have all these powers, who does have all these love interests, who does matter, and is also going through this adventure in this world that is constantly trying to, dehumanize her, take away her agency. It's part of the reason why even the title focuses on her bones, right? Her body. There's all these people that want to control her body, take ownership over her body. And I think even Black women today and women of color are very aware of the ways in which politically, socially, in terms of legislation, even just recently in Texas, there are all these forces that just want to take control and ownership over your body and take away your agency. So imagine, in the 19th century, young Black women, right? Again, going off of Sarah Bartman's story, who she didn't have any control over her agency. She had no agency because she was literally displayed in a human zoo until she died. And then even after she died, her body was dissected and placed in a museum in France. So even in death, her body, people still took ownership over her body. And I think it wasn't until maybe the 80s or the 90s that they were able to repatriate her bones back to South Africa, where she came from. But, I really wanted to make sure that this was a story that especially young Black women could relate to, that they could see themselves, their struggles, but also see themselves as special, as chosen, as, desirable and loved, and as having agency and all of these things. That was my main goal for this story.
And that resonates with me hugely too, as you probably know from Wings of Ebony. Very, very similar goal. And I love that we're able to put these books on shelves so that the next generation of readers gets to grow up with these books in existence as a very sort of normal, expected thing, which I think is very unusual for people from our generation. So on a slightly lighter note, talk to me, and I haven't finished, so no spoilers, but talk to me about weaving, romance into a book that's a bit heavy topically, the juxtaposition there. Now, I assume I've gotten far, there's definitely attraction between two characters in particular, Iris and Adam. Did I get that right?
Yeah, definitely. Iris and Adam.
Yeah, there's definitely attraction there from the very beginning. And, I love a good romance. And so I'm just wondering, more about sort of the challenges and the fun of grafting a romance plot thread into a story that is so sort of topically serious. I really struggled with this in Wings of Ebony because in the first book, the plot is very sort of racism oriented, and I really hesitated to put anything else in to compete with that narrative, because I know that's why readers love our romance plot threads. And so I decided in a sort of unconventional way to make book one very much about that and kind of set up the romance for the sequel, which is a lot more romance focused. The romance plays a bigger part. And so I was really loving how you wove it in and grafted it in very intentionally. I also think it's really impressive when people can write from multiple perspectives with very distinct voices. Because if I'm not mistaken, Adam opens the book, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it just pulled me right in, which I just think, yeah. So anyway, I'm just curious about what that was like, grafting in a romance thread, and how you balance sort of, keeping sort of the tone of the story and the goal of the story front and center, but then using the romance to complement that.
Yeah, I struggle with that a lot because, and I don't want people to think that this book only deals with heavy things. At its heart, it's a fun fantasy novel, and I wanted it to be a fun fantasy novel. That's why I tell people, it's supernatural Hunger Games in 19th century London, because it has action, it has the adventure, it has the fantasy, and I really wanted to make sure that it was a story that you could take a lot of important things away from. At the same time, you would also have fun reading it. And I guess I just, I try to take inspiration from a lot of the things that I've consumed. I often say, even in my biography, that I'm inspired obviously by other books, but I'm inspired by all kinds of things. I'm inspired by video games like Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts. inspired by movies, Marvel movies, DC movies, TV shows, anime, and a lot of the things that have really been like seminal for me as a storyteller have been these sort of more epic stories that have the serious themes and also has the romance and also has the action and this and that. So I just really took a lot of inspiration from that and making sure that there was, there's funny moments and there's action and there's romance and there's lighter moments and there's this larger backdrop of, this more serious setting, and the setting, I guess the setting is just, I didn't set out to try to make it serious or gloomy or anything like that. But I think it just, looking at the 19th century through the eyes of a Black person, in 19th century London and thinking about, okay, yeah, she would deal with racism. She would deal with this. She would deal with that. I think it just automatically, colored the story in a way. So there is this fun stuff happening, but it's happening through the perspective largely of Iris, a young Black girl who is going to be up against all of the serious stuff because that's what it would be like largely to be, a Black person in 19th century London. And, the story is a bit gothic, but that doesn't mean that you can't have all these other fun things. Now, whether it was executed well or not, I think people will decide for that themselves. Some people might say, okay, there's too much romance. I want more of like the gritty stuff. And then other people might say, well, the gritty stuff is too heavy for me. I wish you, made the romance more front and center. And I think that's just a necessary consequence of when you're trying to sort of weave all these things together. But I just really wanted to create a complete experience and something that felt kind of like epic scale so people can take things out of it. And it was fun. It was fun to write.
Listen, you are good at writing some romantic tension. Let me tell you.
Thank you.
But I was just like, ooh, like even before anything had really like popped off between them, it was something she had tripped or fallen or something, and like the way he caught her, and just the thing about Iris that you do so well, like in my very non-expert opinion, is just that like you can't help but care about this girl very deeply because you just sort of rue, for lack of a better word, you're angry at the situation that she's in, and she has this very delicate innocence to her. Mm-hmm. And I just reading it fiercely want to protect that. Like there's something about just the way that she reads, like she's just so soft. And like when you read this magically talented Black girl in this situation that I don't love, I just, the lioness in me just wants to like her. And so anyway, so when you see her react to like Adam's touch or just him being close by, like it just gives you that sort of like that sweet, precious feeling of like, yes, these are the good things in life you can have when you get away from all of these monsters. Like you just want her to be able to like sit in that sweetness. And again, I haven't finished it, but the way that you breadcrumb it, I think is really well done. So
and like there are different people. She has different suitors in the book. I mean, there's Jin. I think Jin is the one that has more of the sweet, and Max as well. He's kind of a street fighter, and he's very cheerful and kind of in your face, goofy, and a lot of fun. And Adam, her relationship with Adam is very tense as well, because I think what he wants from her is not entirely on level.
Adam has goals, okay? I haven't finished, so I don't know where my allegiance is. Max was super eager when they first met, and I'm like, do I trust you? But then it's like, I think it's because we were in Adam's head for a chapter, so I'm like, oh, I don't know. Who knows? That's the fun part. You get to root for whomever and change your allegiance whenever you want, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. I come from a world of shipping, right? Like when you're in like narrative fandom or whatever kind of fandom, there's going to be a lot of shipping involved. People are going to ship one person with another, like with one person, with 3 different people, with 4 different people, different pairings. Sometimes people who have different pairings like fight against each other. It's really weird. Like, it's so odd when I see, like, even Marvel movies has weird shippers, like people that are like Captain America and the Falcon versus Captain America and Tony Stark, Iron Man. Am I just okay? Now it's getting weird, but yeah, this is me. This is me like revealing my my secret fangirl life. But yeah, like I was really inspired by that kind of thing as well. But just making sure that everybody has chemistry with everybody, so you can just like choose whatever ship you like.
You do it so well. You do it really, really well. No, I love it. And going into the sequel for Wings of Ebony, as an aside, one of my major goals of that book was to create ship wars, like full on wars. That is an objective of that narrative, and I think it does it. So we'll see. My next question is actually, again, on a slightly lighter note, a big part of this book is the circus. So I'd love to, like, is that something that you just were obsessed with as a child? Like, what is your relationship with the circus? I've been to like 3 when I was very little, and I honestly don't remember much about them, but I was very curious to know, because the circus is sort of this like veneer of this story. And so anyway, I was curious if that came from anything that you personally loved or your experience.
I don't know. I remember going to see Cirque du Soleil with my parents, and I really love and appreciate like the amount of work and effort it takes to be like a trapeze artist or it's, you know, a tightrope dancer or anything. And I watched the anime Kaleido Star, and I was obsessed with that for a while. But you know, again, for Iris as the main character, I really like the idea of her sort of having to struggle with being on display. You know, like she's on display for the consumption, I guess, of this audience, largely European audience that, you know, sees her as exotic. And I did a lot of research into like Barnum and Bailey and, you know, a lot of 19th century exhibitions at World's Fairs and other kinds of circuses. Woo!
Are you okay?
Sorry. It is raining outside, and there was just a huge, like, Zeus level.
I heard it.
You heard it?
I heard it. It sounded like something like shaking.
Yeah, I was like, is the house, like, crumbling? What's going on? But yeah, whew. So that was thunder for the ages. Sorry, y'all. We're back.
We still have time, so let's
my house.
Let's go through a few more questions.
I can't even remember if I finished the last question. But I think I finished the last question. I think I did. I think that was like Mother Nature's timer to keep us on time. So we're good. I like the circus, y'all.
Sorry, I'm getting kid noise behind me, so I'm trying to send text messages to stop it.
I can
My next questions were actually craft related. I'm sorry. So switching gears to writing, what's your process like? You're several books in now, so I'd love to hear a little bit about how your writing process has evolved over several books. I'd just love to know kind of where you're at, because this is your 4th, right?
Yeah.
4th or 5th?
It's my 5th. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about how your writing process has evolved. Are you a pantser or a plotter, or what that's like for you?
I'm definitely a plotter. I definitely need to outline things. I don't know if that's just like my control issues, like my type A, like everything has to be organized. But, you know, I really like the idea of having an outline of where the story is going to go. And I think it's a good idea to have to know where your story is going to go across, especially if you're writing a series, like across the series. It doesn't have to be like completely outlined, but just to have a good general idea of where things are going to go. It helps me feel less like I'm kind of like floating around and, in this nebulous space where anything can happen. It gives me a little bit more, limitation. And limitation isn't necessarily a bad thing. It gives you like these boundaries. That, okay, you're working within this space, that this can happen. And you still allow yourself to be flexible. I think that I have, and this is, if my editor is watching, she's going to be shocked, but I think that I have learned to actually write more quickly over the years, but it's just that sometimes, certain things in life happens that just completely derails you, and you just, like writing The Bones of Ruin, I actually wrote it pretty quickly, the first draft pretty quickly, when I actually sat down to write it. But it was just a matter of being able to sit down to write. And when there's so many things going on, like the pandemic, there's so many crises that were happening in a lot of people's lives. And I think a lot of shared trauma that we had, that I don't know if we've really collectively come to terms with the shared trauma that we have worldwide, and just as a global community, and just the ways in which this has changed, how we work, and changed, perhaps our productivity level. Like when I sit down to write, I can write a lot more quickly than I wrote, than back when I was writing my very first book. At the same time, because of all these things that are happening, sometimes it can feel like such a task just to bring yourself to the laptop to sit down and to write, and to give yourself that time when maybe, you're just not in the headspace, or you're having brain fog or whatever else, and you're just not as productive as you could be. So, I'm an outliner, and typically I write quickly. It's just, I think there's like the psychological challenges that have come up in the recent years, that now it's like, okay, I have to try and confront this so that I can like be as productive as I know I can be. But just for any writers out there that, maybe you're going through the same thing, I do think, again, when it comes to productivity, we all have to be mindful of what we're going through, and not just the shared things, but even the personal things that we may be going through. Like I went through a heck of a year in 2019, and that was before the plague was, unleashed upon the world. So, do what you can always. And I think that's something that I've learned over the years as well, is just to be kind to myself, do what you can, and, push yourself when you need to push yourself, but know that it's okay to not be, 100% efficient. This capitalist system always demands that we be efficient at all times, and it's like, but we're human. So, give yourself time to not be efficient all the time. Give yourself that grace, I would say.
I completely agree. And you definitely speak like someone who has written many books, because I feel like I've, just come through sort of the debut season, and that's like all consuming, and it can just like eat you alive, I think. And I do think it ate me alive a little bit. And then sort of that happening, my debut happening on the heels of 2020. And so anyway, I hear you. And I think that my mindset too has very much shifted to what you're talking about, and just sort of taking one thing at a time, and really giving yourself space and grace to process and do things as you can, is something that I'm definitely learning. And I think that that's really transformed my writing process in a great way, actually, as I work on more work-life balance. So I love that. I had a couple more questions for you, and then we can wrap up. The hour has flown by.
I think it's 7:45.
I wanted to ask you, these two are kind of like fun reading-esque questions, but what can readers expect from you next? Be it, something in sort of the Bones and Ruin world, or, something completely different. On the sci-fi front, are there more things coming in that area? So would love to know sort of what you're working on, as much as you can tell us.
Well, yeah, thanks. I'm working on book 2 of The Bones of Ruin. And I am also working on middle grade novels. Like, I'm hoping to sort of expand into middle grade. Didn't you sell one recently, or you're working on one?
Yes, I did. I sold a series that comes out next year.
Do you want to plug it quick? It's the Magic School one, right?
No. Bones of Ruin. We're good.
Okay. Well, I just love like sharing the love, and just like I'm so excited for more Black YA. You and I, and so many others that we're sort of in the circle and networking with, and we're really kind of like the newest generation, I guess, of Black authors, Black sci-fi authors putting our work out there. And it really does feel like somewhat of a zeitgeist. Like, it feels like I'm sort of just riding on this wave of young Black creativity and just Black creativity in the sci-fi world and the fantasy world that is so needed, in children's publishing, whether it's at the teen level or, the middle grade level or picture book or whatever. And, that's something that I just want to continue to do. I obviously will continue to write my young adult novels, but I would love to continue to write, middle grade as well, and just for different reading levels, because, going back to what we talked about a little earlier, when we were growing up, we didn't have as much content. Like, I certainly did not have all of these books, at my fingertips. So I just want to contribute to putting more books out there so that young Black girls like us, like when we're still relatively young, but I mean, like, the young ones coming up now can, read it. Black girls and Black boys and can read, themselves in literature. And I'm also thinking about my niece, who I think is 11 years old. And, she wants to read The Bones of Ruin, but I'm like, oh, it's a little too old. So the reading level is a little too old and it's a little bit too mature. So I'm thinking, okay, I want to put out a middle grade book so that she can read it too. So that's definitely something that I'm going to continue to sort of work on, and expanding my bibliography within the world of children's publishing. I don't know about adult publishing. We'll have to wait a few years to see if I have an adult book in me.
So Bones of Ruin is 2 or 3 books? The series?
3 books.
It'll be 3 books. We get 2 more Bones of Ruin books, and then we get middle grade from Sarah Raughley. That's very exciting. My last question for you, and it's sort of it's a question and then sort of a sign-off question, and I'm sure Drew will be back soon. But are you reading anything fun lately that you want to share or talk about?
I am reading for the courses that I am teaching. I'm actually an English professor. So the first book that I'm teaching in a course about African American women writers is Incidents in the Life of Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. And, I've read all these books before, obviously, studied them, wrote on them. But being able to teach them you have to kind of be in a different frame of mind. But I'm also looking at them from the perspective of a writer, it's so easy to look at a lot of these books, like a Toni Morrison book, and just read it and analyze it and just think about the themes. But you also want to consider, what's going to be your beloved, what's going to be your bluest eye, and try and how did Toni Morrison put this together, you know? And if you think about it from a crafts perspective, it's really interesting to think, you know, like, how does somebody sit down to write something like Beloved or Song of Solomon? It's just,
it's mind blowing. It's absolutely mind blowing. Like,
it is mind blowing. Like, wow. But
it is literally breathtaking. Like, it is literally, like, when you sit with it at any level, but at a craft level, it's just like, and done with such efficiency, right? Like, I can make a point, but it's going to take me like 1,000 pages to get there.
Yeah. So, you know, it's one of those things that as a writer, you always say to other writers as advice, you got to read to learn how to write, right? So, you know, when you have the opportunity to read from the greats, just, you know, nowadays, I'm really trying to not just look at it as a English student, you know, analyzing the themes and this and that, but or as a professor analyzing the themes, but as a writer, you know, how does one put a book together like this? You know, how do you efficiently make your point? How do you plot? How do you craft, you know, these characters and things like that? So it's giving me a new perspective on things. Definitely.
Well, yay. Well, I mean, this has been so much fun. I've learned so much. I just love talking to other authors about their processes and their inspiration behind their work. And I didn't know you were an English professor. Anyway, I've just learned so much. So I appreciate you letting me come and hang out with you. Where can we find you online?
Online. I am tired. I haven't had dinner, y'all. So my website is sarahraughley.com. So sarahraughley.com, and you can find my socials from there. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at s_Raughley, and I don't use Facebook, but you know, I'm trying to limit like the amount of socials that I'm on, just because it can be so time consuming, and you know, I usually just use my socials for promotional purposes. But if you ever want to drop me a line or tell me, you know, what you thought about my book or any of my books, just want to chat, definitely hit me up on Twitter or Instagram, and I'll likely respond to you fairly quickly.
Yay! Well, Bones of Ruin. Oh, and I'm online too. This is my sequel. It is out in June. I did grab it. I was like, I can at least show a copy of it.
That cover killed me when I first saw it. I was like,
I was very nervous about, not nervous like in a bad way, but just like anxious to see how the cover artist is going to top the first one, because I feel like the first cover is so striking. And when I saw this, I gasped, like audibly gasped.
Yeah.
There's just so much like power in that image, and just anyway. So, but I'm on socials everywhere. Not everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter at author JL JELLE. So if anybody wants to follow or see any of my, currently I'm trying to redecorate my house. So if that interests you, check my IG stories. I've been doing polls and like literally having people vote on like light fixtures and like rugs, and like literally my social media is deciding the things that are making it.
Good way to do it.
I have choice paralysis at this point. So anyway, but this has been a treat. I wasn't sure, Drew, if you're coming back on.
Yeah, I'm here. I just wanted to let you guys talk. I didn't want to interrupt. I was enjoying it. All right.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you both for being here with me tonight. I really love when I get to do the in-conversations, because I get to just enjoy a good conversation, and I don't have to be nervous in front of a camera. But now I have to do the shameless thing and plug by the bookstore. So, if you were listening tonight and you went, gee, I'd like a copy of The Bones of Ruin. Gee, I'd like to read Wings of Ebony before the sequel comes out. You can get these books. You can get them at Town Book Center in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. We are located, like I said, in Collegeville. We're right across the street from the Wegmans. If you are not comfortable going out and about, if you are listening from somewhere other than Pennsylvania and you don't feel like making that large of a drive, that is definitely an option. You can always order from us online at townbc.com. That's TOW. N as in Nike, E as in Echo, B as in Bravo, C as in Charlie.com. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, you can hit that little subscribe button and be informed whenever we're doing another one of our amazing virtual author events. Again, thank you both so much for being with me here tonight, and thanks to everyone for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Sarah. I hope you had a wonderful life.